The setting sun painted the low-slung houses in gold as I navigated the well-worn street, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like tired limbs. My ancient delivery van protested with a series of groans, its engine rattling in a rhythm that matched the ache in my bones. Beside me, the day's final delivery, a little brown paper-wrapped box, slid across the passenger seat. I eyed the childish scrawl of the address, then the dashboard clock glowing a persistent 6:30 p.m. My phone had buzzed 3 times already, each a notification from my mother. "Leo, be home for dinner. Don't be late." Her words were always a directive, never a question. No inquiry about how I was feeling or if I was swamped with work. It was just an order, a piece of her perfectly arranged schedule that I was expected to click into place. I'm Leo, 28, and I spend my days driving for a small-time courier service in Seattle. It's not a terrible living, but it's certainly not one that inspires conversation. I'm out the door before dawn, weaving through the city's labyrinth of avenues and alleys, dropping parcels at every imaginable address, and I don't punch out until the world is completely dark. My wages cover the essentials, rent for a tiny room way out on the edge of the city, and just enough left over to wire a small sum to my parents now and then. It's a gesture I'm not even sure they notice, but I do it anyway. To my family, though, I might as well be invisible. It's not that I've ever caused them any real trouble. My only crime is that I'm not Daniel. Daniel, who is 3 years younger than me, has always been the family's shining star. He's got one of those effortless, brilliant smiles that disarms you instantly. He can spin a story like a seasoned performer, charming his way out of any screw-up and leaving everyone laughing. He makes it look so easy. From the time we were boys, my mother dubbed him her golden child. Meanwhile, I was just me, the awkward older one who could never quite get it right, no matter how hard I scrambled to keep up. I'll never forget the day she said it right to my face that Daniel was destined for big things. As for you, Leo, she'd added almost as an afterthought, you just need to be a hard worker. That will be enough for you. Her tone was meant to be reassuring, I think, but the words landed like a blade twisting in my gut. A dull, corroded knife. Even now, years later, the memory of it burns. I try not to resent Daniel for it. It's not like he asked to be the one they pinned all their hopes on. He was just born into that role. Still, a question haunts me late at night. If things had been different, if they had seen me, who would I be today? Would I have a life that felt like my own, instead of waking up each morning feeling like a poorly sketched outline standing next to his vibrant, finished portrait? And today is Friday, which means the mandatory family dinner. It's important for us to be together, my mother always declares, but I've long understood that us doesn't really include me. The gathering is a performance, not a connection. It's Daniel's personal stage where he unveils his latest brilliant venture, some tech startup with jargon about venture capital and scalability that flies right over my head. My role is to sit silently, pushing lukewarm food around my plate, offering a mechanical nod when prompted and pretending not to hear my father on the phone in the next room, booming with pride as he recounts Daniel's latest triumph to a neighbor. Just a few blocks from my parents' house, I parked the van in front of a brightly lit convenience store to drop off that final box. A cool breeze had picked up, but a film of sweat still slicked my brow, a mixture of the day's labor and the dread of what was coming. A middle-aged woman with hair dyed a startling shade of red accepted the package. She gave me a tired but genuine smile. "You really put in the hours, don't you?" she said. Her simple words hung in the air, a small, unexpected kindness. I could only manage a nod in return, caught off guard. I'm not built for compliments. They feel like a foreign language I can't quite translate. Back in the driver's seat, my phone buzzed again. It was another text from Mom. "Daniel has a huge surprise for us tonight. Get here soon. The whole family is waiting." I let out a long, slow breath and jammed the phone back into my pocket. A huge surprise. Right, I could already picture it. Another of Daniel's elaborate tales. A new investment secured, a glamorous new girlfriend, maybe even just a pair of expensive sneakers that would earn him a chorus of oohs and ahs from our mother. It's not jealousy, not anymore. I'm just exhausted, worn down by the constant pressure to be the supportive older brother, the one who swallows his own disappointments and never ever complains. My parents' place is in one of those older parts of town where the houses huddle together, their stucco exteriors discolored by time and their wrought iron fences flaking with rust. I pulled up to the curb, killed the engine, and just sat there for a long minute, letting the silence of the van envelop me. Outside, the faint sound of a car horn bleated in the distance, answered by the sharp, territorial bark of a dog down the street. A quick glance in the rearview mirror confirmed what I already felt. My eyes were sunken, framed by dark circles so deep they looked permanently carved into my skin. It felt like I hadn't had a decent night's sleep in a decade. Just get through dinner, Leo. I coached myself. Eat your food, make your escape, go home. As soon as I walked through the door, the savory smell of my mother's braised pork filled the air. She was a whirlwind of motion in the kitchen while my father was already settled into his favorite armchair, his attention locked on the television. But Daniel, he wasn't here yet. "Hey, Dad," I said. He offered a non-committal grunt in reply, his gaze never leaving the screen. Mom spun around from the stove, her eyes immediately sweeping over me from head to toe, her brow furrowed in disapproval. "Working late again? Honestly, Leo, look at your shirt, it's filthy. Go upstairs and wash up before your brother gets here. I don't want him seeing you looking like such a mess." I mumbled an okay and dragged myself up the stairs. My old bedroom has long since become a dumping ground for the family's odds and ends, but on a dusty shelf I saw a familiar photograph in a cheap frame. It was the four of us. Mom, Dad, Daniel, and me. I must have been 15, which would have made him 12. In the picture, I'm standing behind him with my arms slung protectively over his shoulders, both of us beaming with wide, unforced smiles. I remember that feeling so clearly. I was his big brother, the one who was supposed to look out for him. How naive I was. Now I'm not sure what I am to him or to any of them. By the time I came back downstairs, Daniel had made his grand entrance. He was already at the dining table, looking immaculate in a starched white button-down, his hair styled perfectly with some expensive-looking product. "Yo, big bro," he called out, flashing that signature high-wattage smile. "Been a while. You holding up okay?" I just nodded and took the seat opposite him. He always used that nickname, Big Bro, with a playful, almost condescending lilt. It was his way of reminding me that I was just a supporting player in the blockbuster movie of his life. Dinner started. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying the pot of braised pork, which she set down directly in front of Daniel. "It's your favorite, sweetie, isn't it?" she cooed, her voice dripping with affection, like she was talking to a toddler. Daniel nodded appreciatively before diving into his big announcement. It was some new cryptocurrency venture he was launching. He spouted a stream of buzzwords that were clearly meant to impress. Blockchain, seed funding, disrupting the future. I couldn't follow most of it, but my father was hanging on every word, his eyes shining with vicarious pride. "This one, he's got the vision," Dad declared, then swiveled his gaze to me. "So, Leo, how's that delivery gig of yours? Still all right?" "It's fine," I said, my voice clipped. There was no point in saying more. Even if I had something to share, they wouldn't really be listening. My life was just the boring filler between Daniel's exciting updates. "Fine is good," my mother added, but her voice was laced with a familiar, gentle pity, the kind you'd use on someone who just lost a race. "You just keep working hard, Leo. Everything will work out." I forced down a mouthful of rice, trying to ignore the subtle way she stressed the words, working hard, as if that was the absolute ceiling of my potential. It was her go-to platitude for me. Daniel continued to hold court, his voice gaining momentum as he spun his narrative of inevitable success. But as he talked, I noticed things. He seemed thinner than the last time I'd seen him, and his eyes were tinged with red. His fingers drummed a nervous, incessant rhythm on the tabletop, a jittery energy he couldn't seem to contain. Something was definitely not right, but the feeling was vague, a shadow I couldn't quite grasp. Just as my mother was launching into a fresh round of praise for his business acumen, his phone vibrated on the table. He shot a look at the screen, and for a fleeting instant his features hardened. "Excuse me," he announced abruptly, pushing his chair back. "I have to take this." He slipped out the back door into the yard. I watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. He'd been getting these calls a lot recently. They were always hushed and quick, and he'd always return to the room wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a mask of nonchalance that seemed more fragile each time. The last time this happened, I'd overheard him in the backyard, his voice low as he mentioned goods and payments. When I'd asked him about it later, he'd just laughed it off. "Business stuff, you know how it is," he'd said, deflecting with his usual charm. But this time I saw that my mother was watching him go too. A small crease appeared between her eyebrows before she quickly smoothed her expression and turned her attention back to me, abruptly changing the topic. "Leo, did you remember to send money this month?" she asked, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were inquiring about the time. A familiar pang of resentment hit me, but I just nodded. I sent them money every single month without fail, and not once had they ever acknowledged it with a simple thank you. Meanwhile, Daniel, who never contributed a cent, always seemed to have an endless supply of cash for designer clothes, fancy restaurants, and the sleek sports car parked out front that no one ever questioned how he paid for. When Daniel came back inside, his smile was firmly back in place, but I saw his hand shake almost imperceptibly as he reached for his chopsticks. "Everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. He shot me a look, and for a second his mask slipped. His eyes were a chaotic mix of emotions, worry maybe, or was it anger? I couldn't be sure. "All good, big bro," he said, the old nickname sounding hollow. "Just work." His smile was a thin, brittle thing that did nothing to hide the tension in his eyes. After dinner, I cleared the table and washed the dishes, just like I always did. It was an unspoken rule that Daniel was exempt from such chores. As I was drying my hands, getting ready to make my escape, he cornered me near the front door. "Hey," he said, his voice unusually low. "You busy tomorrow?" His question caught me off guard. "What's going on?" I asked. He paused for a beat, then gave a casual shrug. "It's nothing major, just... I need you to help me with a delivery. It's a small thing. Shouldn't take you long at all." I stared at him, that same sense of foreboding creeping back stronger this time. "Deliver what?" He slapped my shoulder with a forced heartiness, that practiced grin spreading across his face again. "Just a package, man. Don't sweat it, I'll fill you in tomorrow." Before I could ask another question, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway with a gut feeling so bad it was almost a physical presence. Later that night, as I lay on the narrow bed in my tiny rented room, sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying disjointed images, Daniel with wads of cash, the hushed phone calls, the tremor in his hand. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. He was just a spoiled kid who'd always had it easy, not some kind of criminal. But a cold certainty was settling in the pit of my stomach. Something was very, very wrong, and what terrified me wasn't what might happen to Daniel. It was what would happen to me. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that if his world came crashing down, I would be the one buried under the rubble. The next morning, the piercing shriek of my alarm clock ripped through the silence, a frantic buzzing sound like a bug caught in a jar. 30 a.m. Outside, the sky was a blanket of impenetrable black. My small room smelled of yesterday's coffee and the persistent damp odor of old, water-stained wallpaper. I lay there for a minute, paralyzed by a vague sense of dread, trying to piece together the fragments of a dream that had already dissolved. All that remained was the image of Daniel's face, that strained smile, those shifty eyes. His words from the night before echoed in my head, a single sour note that wouldn't resolve. "Help me with a delivery." I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was working myself up over nothing. Daniel was immature and entitled, sure, but he wasn't stupid enough to get into real trouble. Was he? Pulling on a faded t-shirt and my worn baseball cap, I walked out to the van. It was the start of another day, another endless circuit of the city. But as I settled into the driver's seat, a weight I couldn't name pressed down on me. Something felt deeply wrong, like the unsettling quiet that follows a strange sound in the middle of the night, when you're not sure if you imagined it or if you should be afraid. While I choked down a piece of toast, I sent Daniel a quick text. "What's this package? I've got a full route today." Silence. No reply came. I stuffed the phone in my pocket, fired up the van's grumbling engine, and began my day. The hours melted away in a haze of blaring horns, exhaust fumes, and gritty, sun-baked pavement. I dropped off one box after another, doing my best to push thoughts of Daniel from my mind. But every time my phone buzzed, my shoulders tensed. I'd snatch it up, a flicker of hope that it was him, only to be met with a dispatch notification or another text from my mother. "Be home for dinner. Daniel has something important to talk about." It was always about Daniel. I let out a long sigh, a familiar ache settling in my chest. Would there ever be a day when I was the subject of a family conversation? Just once? Late in the afternoon, a message from Daniel finally appeared. "Big bro, come by the house around 6. It's just a little package. Help me out. Thanks." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I wanted to demand more information, to tell him I wasn't his personal errand boy, but I held back. Maybe it really was just something for his startup. I didn't have the energy for another argument, and I certainly didn't want to endure a lecture from my mother about how I needed to stop being so jealous of my brilliant younger brother. "Phew, fine," I typed back, then put the phone away. As dusk began to settle, I pointed the van toward my parents' neighborhood. The street I'd driven down 1,000 times suddenly felt alien, as if its familiar facades were concealing something sinister. I parked at the far end of the alley and, out of pure muscle memory, went to check the cargo bay. It was the usual scene, a couple of undelivered packages, my toolbox, and a half-drunk bottle of water rolling around on the floor. I slammed the hatch shut, locked the van, and headed for the house. The rich aroma of beef stew drifted from the kitchen, layered with the sound of my mother muttering to herself about Daniel being late yet again. My father sat in his armchair, rustling a newspaper, but I could tell he wasn't actually reading it. It was his standard move, a prop to avoid having a real conversation with me. "Leo, you made it," Mom called out, her voice bright but strained. "Go get cleaned up. Daniel should be home any minute, and then we can eat." A few minutes later, Daniel walked in. He was dressed in a black hoodie, a stark contrast to his usual preppy, put-together style. His eyes were shot with red, making him look like he hadn't slept in days. There was a frantic, wired energy coming off him that set my teeth on edge. "Yo, big bro," he said, but the words were flat, stripped of their usual swagger. I took my seat at the table, my eyes fixed on him. "Where's this package?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. He seemed to snap out of a daze, blinking a few times before forcing a grin. Right. I'll get it for you after we eat." "No big deal." Dinner started, but the air in the room was thick with an unspoken tension. My mother kept trying to draw Daniel out about his crypto business, but his answers were clipped and evasive, his gaze constantly darting down to his phone. My father said nothing, just offered a dutiful nod whenever Mom lauded Daniel's supposed genius. I moved the food around my plate, the beef stew tasting like ash in my mouth. Each bite felt impossible to swallow. "Daniel, honey, are you feeling all right?" Mom finally asked, a note of real concern breaking through her usual adoration. He nodded without looking up, but I saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped his phone under the table. And then, in a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of the evening, it all fell apart. The shrill, escalating scream of police sirens sliced through the quiet street, getting closer, closer, until they seemed to be right outside. The sound was followed by the thunder of heavy boots on the pavement, and then a series of thunderous, urgent bangs on the front door. My mother leaped to her feet, her face a mask of chalky white. "What is that? What's happening?" she shrieked, stumbling toward the door in a panic. I shot a look at Daniel, but his head was bowed, his eyes still fixed on the screen of his phone as if it were the only thing in the world. He was frozen. The front door burst open and 3 police officers filled the frame, their dark uniforms and hard, impassive faces sucking all the air out of the room. "Leo Miller!" one of them yelled, his voice like cracking ice. My heart slammed against my ribs as I managed a numb nod. "We have a warrant to search your vehicle," he stated, not asked. "Open the back." My legs felt like they were made of stone. "What's this about?" I managed to choke out, but the officer just stared me down. "Open the back." I walked toward the van in a daze, my parents shuffling behind me. My mother's face was ghostly, and my father was muttering under his breath about some kind of terrible mistake. Daniel hadn't moved from the doorway. I could see his dark shape silhouetted against the light from the house, a motionless spectator to my ruin. With trembling hands, I unlocked the hatch and pulled it open. The sound of my own pulse was a deafening roar in my ears. An officer leaned inside, rummaged for a moment, and then pulled out a clear plastic bag. It was filled with dozens of smaller baggies of white powder. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like every drop of blood in my body had turned to ice. "What is this?" the officer demanded, holding the bag up so it caught the flashing blue and red lights. I shook my head, a strangled sound escaping my throat. "I don't know," I stammered. "That's not mine. I've never seen that before." But I could see in their faces that they didn't believe a word of it. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists as they snapped them shut. My mother let out a piercing scream, but her words weren't for me. "This is a misunderstanding. My son would never do something like this," she cried. But her desperate gaze was fixed on Daniel. She was pleading for him, not for me. They shoved me toward the police car, my head reeling. In the split second before the door slammed closed, sealing me in darkness, I caught one last glimpse of Daniel. He was still standing there, his head bowed, his eyes glued to the ground. He wouldn't look at me. And in that gut-wrenching moment, I knew. The small package he'd wanted me to deliver, it was right there, in that evidence bag. He had set me up. Hours later at the police station, the harsh fluorescent lights felt like they were searing my retinas. I sat on a frigid metal bench, the cuffs still digging into my skin. An officer sat across from me, his voice a dispassionate monotone. "Leo, we found a significant amount of narcotics in your vehicle. You know what they are? Just tell us the truth. It will go easier for you if you cooperate." "I don't know anything about it," I repeated, my voice raw and cracking. It was the only truth I had left. I swear to God I have no idea where that came from. But the words felt hollow, useless. Who was I? Just a delivery guy. I had no money, no influence, no one in my corner. I was the perfect fall guy. Eventually my parents were allowed to see me. They stood on the other side of a thick pane of glass, my mother weeping, my father staring at the floor with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The officer who had been questioning me left the room, giving us a moment of privacy. I looked at my mother, a desperate, silent plea in my eyes. I was waiting for her to say it was all a horrible mix-up, that they were fixing it, that she was sorry. Instead, she leaned closer to the glass and whispered, her voice shaking with tears. "Leo, you have to do this. You have to take the blame for this." The world tilted on its axis. "Daniel can't go to prison," she continued, her words a torrent of panicked justification. "He has such a bright future. You're the strong one. The lawyer said he can get you a lighter sentence. He'll take care of everything." I stared at her, my chest constricting with a pain so sharp it felt like my heart was physically breaking apart. What did you just say?" I whispered. My father finally spoke, his voice hard and final. "You heard your mother. This is for the good of the family. Daniel wouldn't make it in there. You can handle it." I looked from his stony face to my mother's tear-streaked one. These were the people who had raised me, the people I called my family, and in that moment they were complete and utter strangers. There was no apology, no explanation, just a cold, calculated demand that I sacrifice myself for their golden boy. I thought of Daniel, his nervous energy, the secret phone calls, the wads of cash he always seemed to have. And then the truth crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't some terrible mistake. It was a plan, a deliberate, cold-blooded setup, and I was the piece they were willing to lose. "I'm not pleading guilty," I said. My voice was eerily steady, a calm that felt alien and shocking, even to me. My mother stopped crying, her face slack with disbelief. Then she started again, this time with a new, frantic edge. "Leo, you can't. You can't do this to us. Are you trying to tear this family apart?" I didn't reply. I just looked at them, and for the very first time in my 28 years, I felt absolutely no desire to make them happy. The chains that had bound me to their approval had finally snapped. The following morning, they transported me to the King County Courthouse in downtown Seattle. The air inside the courtroom was unnaturally cold, a stark contrast to the oppressive July heat baking the city outside. I sat on the hard bench reserved for the defendant, the worn rubber soles of my sneakers scuffing against the gleaming floorboards. My hands, still tender from the hours spent in cuffs, felt like they belonged to someone else. Across from me sat Arthur, my court-appointed attorney. He was a middle-aged man with a perpetually rumpled suit and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He shuffled through a thick file, his expression one of profound disinterest, as if he hadn't even bothered to learn my name. We had spoken for a grand total of 15 minutes before the proceedings started, during which he delivered his advice in a tired, mechanical drone. "Leo, listen to me. The smart play here is to plead guilty. The evidence against you is overwhelming. A guilty plea will get you a reduced sentence. It's your best option." I shook my head, my throat tight, trying once again to explain that the drugs weren't mine, that my brother had planted them, that I was the victim here. Arthur simply sighed, a puff of weary exasperation. "You can say that all you want," he said, not even looking at me, "but a jury isn't going to buy it." He then pulled out his phone and started scrolling, my entire future apparently less interesting than his email. My gaze swept over the public gallery, searching for my parents. But the seats were empty except for one person. Daniel. He was huddled in the back corner, his head down, his hands twisted together in his lap as if he were trying to crush something between them. He never looked up. He never met my eyes. My mother and father hadn't even bothered to come. I could see them so clearly in my mind's eye, sitting in our old kitchen, the faint scent of last night's dinner still hanging in the air. They would be consoling each other, repeating over and over that everything was going to be okay. But okay for who? Not for me. Never for me. The prosecutor, a small woman with a voice that could cut glass, rose to her feet. She stated my name, Leo Miller, age 28, delivery driver, but she twisted the words, making them sound like a criminal alias. The defendant used his occupation as a cover for his drug trafficking operation, she announced to the jury, holding up the plastic bag of white powder, my death sentence, for all to see. A raw, desperate scream built in my chest. I wanted to leap to my feet and shout that it was a lie, that I was innocent, that they had the wrong man. But Arthur's hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Don't be an idiot," he hissed in my ear. I bit down so hard on my own tongue I tasted blood, a tidal wave of utter powerlessness washing over me. The trial lasted for 3 days, but it felt like a single, suffocating nightmare from which I couldn't wake. Arthur barely moved, just sat beside me, occasionally scribbling a meaningless note on his legal pad while the prosecution methodically dismantled my life. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was a shark. She was relentless, presenting one piece of evidence after another. Photographs of my van, the bag of drugs, my delivery logs, and weaving them into a narrative that painted me as the mastermind of a complex criminal enterprise. The defendant had the opportunity, the means, and the motive, she concluded, her tone dripping with righteous conviction. Motive? My only motive was to get through the day. I was a driver who worked from sunrise to sunset, wiring what little I could spare to my parents, holding on to a flimsy dream of one day opening a little coffee shop of my own. What possible motive could I have for throwing all that away? When it was my turn to speak, I told the truth. I said I had no idea how the drugs got into my van, that someone must have planted them there. But when the prosecutor leaned in and asked, "And who would have done that, Mr. Miller?" I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat. An image of Daniel flashed in my mind, his shifty eyes at the dinner table, my mother's desperate whisper at the police station. Daniel wouldn't survive it. A part of me wanted to stand up, point to the back of the courtroom and scream his name, to tell them all that my own brother had done this to me. But I didn't. Not because I was trying to protect him, but because I knew, with a soul-crushing certainty, that it wouldn't matter. No one would believe me. I was just Leo, the awkward, unremarkable older brother, the one nobody ever took seriously. The perfect scapegoat. On the last day, the judge, a grim-faced man with a mane of silver hair, delivered his judgment. "Leo Miller, this court sentences you to 2 years in a state correctional facility for the crime of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute." The sound of the gavel striking the wood was like the crack of a bone. I stood there paralyzed, my mind a complete and utter void. I could see Daniel still sitting in the back, his head still bowed. As the guards led me out, I turned my head, desperately trying to catch his eye, searching for any flicker of guilt, any sign of regret. But he simply stood up, turned his back and walked out of the courtroom, vanishing behind the heavy wooden doors without a single backward glance. The iron gate of the cell clanged shut behind me, the metallic echo a final, brutal punctuation mark. I was standing in the center of a cold, cramped space, the flickering fluorescent light overhead casting long, distorted shadows on the gray concrete walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and old sweat, a nauseating combination that made my stomach roil. My hands, still feeling the phantom pressure of the cuffs, hung uselessly at my sides. I sank onto the edge of the cot, a thin, stained mattress on a steel slab that felt as unyielding as rock. This was my new home. The King County Correctional Facility, Seattle, Washington, my home for the next 730 days. Me, Leo Miller, 28 years old, delivery driver. Now officially a convicted felon, guilty of a crime I didn't commit. Prison was another planet, and I was an unwelcome alien. Those first few days were a blur of terror and confusion. I had no idea how to navigate this place, how to simply exist without inviting disaster. The other inmates sized me up, their stares a mixture of predatory curiosity and open contempt. There was one guy in particular, a massive man whose arms were a tapestry of faded prison tattoos, who would just stand in a corner of the yard and watch me, his expression unreadable, as if he were weighing the pros and cons of making my life a living hell. I learned quickly to make myself small, to keep my eyes down, to never look at anyone for too long. But the nights were the worst. Lying on that slab of steel and vinyl, sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My mind would betray me, replaying the same agonizing scenes over and over, my mother's performative tears, my father's damning silence, and Daniel, his head bowed in the courtroom, a portrait of cowardly guilt. I tortured myself with the same question night after night. What did I do to deserve this? I worked my ass off. I sent money home. I tried to be a good son, a good brother. So why was I the one locked in a cage while Daniel was out there free, probably sitting at my mother's dinner table weaving his next big lie? For the first week I was practically mute. I'd silently choke down the flavorless slop they served on plastic trays, stale bread, watery beans, and some kind of mystery gravy, and then retreat to my cell, where I'd lie in the dark and wait for the hours to pass. I thought about the coffee shop I used to dream of, a cozy little place filled with the rich, comforting scent of fresh ground beans. A place where I could finally just be me, not Daniel's less impressive older brother. But that dream now seemed like a cruel joke, a childish fantasy from another lifetime. I had nothing left, no savings, no family I could count on, and a future that was a black, empty hole. Then one afternoon during yard time, I met Marcus. He was probably in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. A thin white scar cut a path from his temple to his jaw. He was sitting by himself on a concrete bench, engrossed in a dog-eared paperback, looking completely out of place. I wasn't planning on speaking to anyone ever, but he looked up as I passed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're no drug dealer," he said, his voice a low gravel. I froze, startled. How did you know that?" I asked, my own voice cracking from disuse. A small, weary smile touched his lips. It didn't make him look friendly, just incredibly sharp. "I used to run the books for a crew down in Oakland," he said. "I got good at reading people." "You, kid, you've got the look of someone who got royally screwed." He snapped his book shut and held it out to me. It was an old law textbook, its cover soft and frayed from use, its margins crammed with tiny handwritten annotations. "Read this," Marcus said. "If you ever want to get out of this shithole and have a life, you need to learn the rules of their game. Otherwise, they'll eat you alive." I took the book, its weight feeling strange and significant in my hands. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I had nothing left to lose. That night, under the weak, buzzing light of my cell, I opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with legal precedents, criminal statutes, and explanations of how the justice system was supposed to function. I devoured it, reading line by line, word by word, as if the text itself were a lifeline. I didn't understand half of it at first, but every night I read a little more, scratching my own notes onto scraps of paper whenever I could get my hands on them. Marcus became my unofficial teacher. He didn't just explain the law to me, he taught me about his own area of expertise, following the money. "Cash always tells a story," he'd say, tapping a finger on a page of notes he'd written about shell corporations and laundering schemes. "It always leaves a trail. You just have to know how to find it. Whoever set you up," he told me one day, "they can't erase every track. Sooner or later, they'll slip up." His words sent a jolt through me. I started thinking about Daniel. Really thinking, the wads of cash he'd flash around, the hushed late-night phone calls, the expensive sports car he drove when he didn't even have a legitimate job. I remembered the way he'd refused to look at me when the cops burst in, the way he'd hung his head as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. And then my mother's voice, echoing in my memory. Daniel wouldn't survive it. The pieces were all there, forming a picture so ugly and painful I could barely stand to look at it. My family hadn't just failed to defend me. They had been part of the conspiracy. The more I studied, the more a tiny, stubborn ember of determination began to glow inside me. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was something colder, harder. It was resolve. If I was going to be trapped in this hell, I wouldn't let it consume me. I wouldn't just survive, I would fight back. I started spending every spare moment in the prison library, devouring every book I could find on law, finance, and forensic accounting. I read through old newspaper archives, studying the details of similar drug cases. I filled notebooks with meticulous notes, a discipline I clung to day after day, night after night. Marcus would give me scraps of paper and I'd cover them with diagrams and calculations, learning how to dissect a balance sheet, how to find the cracks in a financial statement. He would watch me work, sometimes offering a quiet nod of approval, other times a rare, thin smile. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Leo," he said one afternoon. "But you need to be careful. The law is a weapon, and it cuts both ways." After I'd been inside for 3 months, I started a journal. It wasn't for venting or self-pity, it was a ledger. I wrote down every single thing I could remember about Daniel's behavior in the months leading up to my arrest. The secretive phone calls, the hushed meetings in the backyard, the vague but grandiose talk about his crypto startup. I had no idea what I would ever do with this information, but the act of recording it, of organizing the betrayal into neat chronological entries, gave me a sliver of control in a world where I had none. One day I got a letter. It was from my mother. Her familiar, unsteady handwriting filled a single sheet of yellow legal paper. She wrote that she missed me, that she thought about me and prayed for me every single day. But there was no apology, not one word of regret or explanation for what they had done. She just asked if I was doing okay and then, incredibly, went on to say how well Daniel was doing. His business was thriving. He'd just bought them a brand new television. I read the letter once, then folded it into a small, tight square and shoved it under my mattress. I didn't write back. It wasn't that I was angry, not anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something cold and empty. I simply had nothing left to say to the woman who had so easily chosen one son over the other. Marcus saw me sitting on my bunk, staring at the wall. He didn't have to ask what was wrong. "Family," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. I just nodded. He shrugged, a gesture that held a world of bitter experience. "Family," he said again. "They can be the best thing you've got, or they can be the anchor that drowns you. At some point, kid, you gotta decide if you're living for them or if you're living for yourself." I looked from his scarred face down to the law book resting in my lap. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I knew the answer. 18 months crawled by. The Leo who walked into this prison was gone, replaced by someone else. I was leaner, my hair was longer, but the real change was in my eyes. The meek, accommodating older brother who would do anything for his family's approval was dead and buried. I had learned to see the world not through the distorted lens of their expectations, but through the clear, cold logic of facts and evidence. As the day of my release got closer, I knew one thing for sure. I was not going back to my old life. Daniel, my mother, my father, they had thrown me into this pit expecting me to break. But they were about to find out that I was walking out of it stronger and smarter than they could possibly imagine. The day I was released from the King County Correctional Facility, the Seattle sky was a flat, miserable gray. A cold drizzle was falling, the tiny drops stinging my face like needles as I stepped into the free world. I stood outside the main gate, dressed in the same worn-out hoodie and frayed sneakers they'd taken from me a year and a half ago. In my hand, I clutched a clear plastic bag containing the sum total of my worldly possessions. A tattered notebook filled with my research, a single pen and that old, faded family photograph, its corners now soft and creased. For a brief, stupid moment, I scanned the street, a small, irrational part of me hoping to see a familiar car, a familiar face, my mother, my father, even Daniel. But the road was deserted. The only sounds, the distant rumble of a passing semi and the sizzle of rain on wet pavement. I drew a long, deep breath. The air tasted of freedom, but it was laced with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. 18 months behind bars had remade me from the inside out, but the world on this side of the wall hadn't changed at all. It didn't even seem to notice I was back. I walked to the nearest bus stop, the plastic bag swinging at my side. I hadn't told a soul I was being released today. A few months ago, another letter had arrived from my mother. It was full of the same empty pleasantries, asking how I was, reporting that Daniel had moved into a fancy new apartment downtown. Still no apology. Still no acknowledgement of what they had done. I hadn't bothered to write back. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. Prison had taught me a hard lesson. Family isn't everything. And I couldn't spend one more day of my life trying to earn the approval of people who had so casually thrown me away. I landed a job at a little coffee shop called The Daily Grind, a cozy spot tucked away on a quiet side street in Fremont, a few miles north of downtown Seattle. The work was straightforward, brewing espresso, wiping down tables, and making just enough small talk to keep the regulars happy. The owner, a laid-back guy in his 40s named Sam, didn't pry into my background. "You show up on time and you do the work, that's all I care about," he said when he hired me. I just nodded, a strange feeling washing over me. For the first time in my life, someone was looking at me and seeing just me, not a pale imitation of my brother. During the day, I mastered the art of pulling the perfect shot and listened to the endless stream of customers' minor triumphs and tragedies. At night, I'd go home to my new place, a room even more cramped than my prison cell, with floorboards that groaned with every step and a single window that looked out onto a graffiti-covered alley. But it was my space, my sanctuary, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually building something of my own. And in that tiny room, I would open the notebook I'd kept in prison. Its pages were a chaotic map of my time inside, dense with legal statutes, accounting principles, and the fragmented memories of Daniel's betrayal. I still didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I couldn't just let what happened go. I couldn't let them bury the truth along with my old life. One night after work, I sat in front of a beat-up second-hand laptop and did something I hadn't been able to do for 18 months. I searched for my brother's name. A flood of results appeared. Young tech visionary shakes up crypto market. Breakout startup sees unprecedented growth. The headlines were slick and breathless, all praising Daniel Miller and his new company DM Capital. I clicked on a link and saw a photo of him in an expensive-looking suit, flashing that familiar practiced smile for the camera. His company, the article explained, specialized in high-yield cryptocurrency investments, promising massive returns to its clients. But as I read, a cold knot of suspicion tightened in my gut. This was Daniel, the kid who couldn't hold down a job for more than a few months, the one who'd always relied on charm and lies to get by. A successful CEO, I wasn't buying it for a second. Marcus's words came back to me as clear as if he were sitting in the room. Money always leaves a trail. Using the techniques he'd taught me, I started to dig. I started with the Washington Secretary of State's business database. The public record showed that DM Capital had been incorporated just over a year ago, shortly after I was sentenced. Daniel was listed as the CEO, but there were other names on the incorporation documents, names I didn't recognize. I kept digging, shifting my search to obscure cryptocurrency forums on Reddit. places where anonymous users traded gossip about scams and fraudulent projects. And there it was, a single anonymous post that mentioned DM Capital by name, calling it a textbook Ponzi scheme. My pulse quickened. I wasn't entirely sure what a Ponzi scheme entailed, but the word itself sounded illicit, dangerous. I meticulously copied down every detail I could find: the company's registration number, the date it was founded, the names of the board members, the verbatim text from the forum post. I started teaching myself how to read corporate financial reports. They were dense and confusing, but I checked out books from the public library, Accounting for Dummies, Introduction to Forensic Auditing, and spent my nights hunched over my laptop trying to decipher the numbers. I was no expert, but prison had taught me one thing above all else: patience. One evening, I almost got sloppy. I was in a dive bar a few blocks from DM Capital's downtown office, nursing a warm beer and trying to look casual. Just as I was about to give up for the night, Daniel walked in. He wasn't alone. With him was a tall, powerfully built man with a shaved head and a black leather jacket. They took a booth in a dark corner, their heads bent close together as they spoke in low, urgent voices. I watched as Daniel slid a thick manila envelope across the table. The other man took it, glanced inside, gave a curt nod, and then stood up and walked out without another word. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I quickly lowered my head, pulling the brim of my baseball cap down, terrified that Daniel would look over and see me. But he didn't. He just sat there for another minute, staring into space. As he finally got up to leave, I caught a glimpse of his face under the dim bar lights. He looked haunted. The confident CEO from the magazine articles was gone, replaced by a man who looked terrified. I rushed home, my hands trembling so badly I could barely type. I wrote down everything I had just witnessed: the man in the leather jacket, the envelope, the look on Daniel's face. It was all starting to click into place. I went back online, this time focusing my search on public blockchain explorers. It took hours, but I finally found it: a cryptocurrency wallet address that had been publicly associated with DM Capital. And from that wallet, a complex web of transactions snaked out to anonymous accounts in places like Panama and the Cayman Islands, places Marcus had told me were notorious havens for hiding dirty money. I didn't know exactly what I was looking at, but I knew each new piece of data was another piece of the puzzle, and I was getting closer to seeing the whole picture. From that night on, my life fell into a rigid, obsessive routine. Work, study, investigate, sleep, repeat. Every night I would sit in front of my laptop, meticulously organizing my findings into a single password-protected file on my hard drive. The corporate records of DM Capital, the names of its mysterious board members, the anonymous forum posts, the blockchain transaction IDs. It was all there. I still didn't know what my endgame was, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. Daniel had sent me to prison. My family had let him. They had decided my fate for me once before. This time I would be the one in control. Outside the window of my tiny apartment, a steady rain was falling, the drops tracing blurry paths down the glass like tears. I sat at my small desk, the laptop screen bathing my face in a cool blue light. All around me were the fruits of my obsession. Stacks of paper covered in my cramped handwriting, filled with names, dates, and long strings of alphanumeric code. These notes represented months of sleepless nights and relentless digging. They were my arsenal. They were my weapon. Not a gun or a knife, but something far more powerful. The truth, compiled and cross-referenced, ready to be deployed. I was not the same Leo Miller who had walked into prison 18 months ago, the meek older brother willing to fall on his sword for his family. I had learned to see the world through a different set of eyes, the eyes of a man who understood that, as Marcus had told me, money always leaves a trail. And Daniel, my golden boy brother, had been careless. He had left a trail a mile wide, His company, DM Capital, was not the brilliant tech venture the media made it out to be. It was a sham, a sophisticated front for a massive money laundering operation, and I had spent every free moment of the last few months painstakingly taking it apart, piece by piece. It had all started with small clues. After that close call at the bar, I knew I had to be smarter, more careful. I stayed away from Daniel's office and confined my investigation to the digital world. I became an expert at navigating public databases, poring over corporate filings on the Secretary of State's website, and lurking in the shadowy corners of Reddit and Telegram where the crypto underworld did its business. An anonymous comment on a Reddit thread had first pointed me in the right direction, hinting that DM Capital was dirty. I followed that thread relentlessly. It led me to a complex chain of blockchain transactions originating from DM Capital's main corporate wallet. The funds were being systematically washed through dozens of smaller anonymous accounts before finally ending up in offshore banks in places like the Cayman Islands. Exactly the kind of place Marcus had described as a paradise for criminals looking to hide their money. I was no financial wizard, but I was methodical. I spent countless hours tracing the flow of funds, cross-referencing every transaction with DM Capital's publicly available financial statements. And the more I looked, the more I found. The numbers didn't add up. The company was reporting impossibly high profits. There were massive, unexplained expenditures and shadowy investments with no paper trail. I wrote it all down, filling page after page of my notebook with my findings. I also started digging into the names of DM Capital's key investors. A little more research revealed that several of them were not legitimate businessmen. They were known associates of criminal organizations, men who had previously been investigated for large-scale drug trafficking operations in Portland and San Francisco. The puzzle was complete. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place when I stumbled upon a leaked email on a dark web forum. In it, Daniel was promising an on-time delivery to someone named Rico. I had no idea who Rico was, but that single word, delivery, hit me like a punch to the gut. It threw me right back to that night, to my brother's casual request to help him with a package. I knew then that I had everything I needed. I had to make my move, but I had to be smart about it. A direct confrontation was out of the question. Daniel would just lie and my parents would rally to his defense just like they always had. I wasn't interested in a screaming match. I wanted the cold, hard facts to do the talking. I wanted to dismantle his world so thoroughly that there would be nothing left for them to defend. I began to assemble an anonymous dossier, a comprehensive file containing every scrap of evidence I had gathered. The blockchain records, the corporate filings, the leaked email, the list of his criminal investors. I organized it all into a clear chronological narrative, just as Marcus had taught me. If you're going to go after someone, he'd said, you do it like a professional. You build an airtight case. And that's exactly what I had done. One night I sat at my desk, my hand hovering over the mouse. I had compiled a list of email addresses, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the local DEA field office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Washington. I drafted a short, anonymous message. To whom it may concern, I am providing evidence of a large-scale money laundering and drug trafficking operation being run through a Seattle-based company called DM Capital. Please see the attached file for details. I attached a single password-protected PDF containing my entire dossier, then scrubbed the file's metadata to make sure it couldn't be traced back to me. Using a secure anonymous email service, I took a deep breath and clicked send. As the message disappeared into the ether, a strange calm washed over me. The knot of tension I'd been carrying in my chest for months finally loosened. It was done, and then I waited. I went back to my life. I went to work at the daily grind, brewed coffee, wiped down tables, and smiled at the regulars as if it were just another day. But my quiet life was a facade. Every morning I would obsessively scan the local news, searching for any mention of my brother or his company. A month went by, then two. A seed of doubt began to sprout. Maybe I had failed. Maybe Daniel was too smart, too well connected to ever get caught. Then one morning, as I was steaming milk for a customer's latte, my phone vibrated with a news alert. The headline made my blood run cold. Local tech CEO arrested in federal raid. I excused myself and rushed to the back room, my hands shaking as I pulled up the article on my phone. And there it was, on the front page of the Seattle Times. DM Capital under investigation for massive fraud and money laundering scheme. The article reported that federal agents had frozen the company's assets and that its CEO, Daniel Miller, was in custody. I read the words again and again, a dizzying mix of shock and vindication swirling inside me. It was finally happening. In the days that followed, Daniel's empire imploded. The news was filled with images of him being led from his office in handcuffs, his face ashen, his usual confident smirk finally gone. His investors, realizing they'd been duped, filed a massive class action lawsuit. The crypto forums that had once praised him now lit up with accusations and outrage, calling DM Capital the biggest Ponzi scheme in the city's history. I watched it all unfold from the quiet solitude of my apartment. I didn't feel triumphant or celebratory, just a quiet, profound sense of equilibrium, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from the world and things were at last as they should be. Justice had been done. A week later, the official charges came down. Daniel was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance. He was facing a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. I heard through the grapevine that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house to hire a high-powered defense attorney. But I knew it was hopeless. The case I had built was airtight. There was no escape for him. After the news broke that my brother had taken a plea deal for 15 years, I knew there was one last thing I had to do. I needed to see him. I needed to tell him what I had done. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning. I put on my usual uniform, a gray hoodie and a baseball cap, and tucked the old prison notebook into my back pocket. I didn't call first. I didn't give them any warning. As far as Daniel knew, I was still locked up. He had never once tried to contact me, never asked how I was doing. His silence didn't shock me, but it still ached. A dull, persistent throb in a place I thought had gone numb. At the correctional facility, I filled out the visitor request form, checking the box for family. The guard at the desk did a double take when he saw my name, then gave me a strange, appraising look. He led me down a long, sterile corridor, and the familiar, sickening smell of disinfectant, stale air, and human misery filled my nostrils, bringing a rush of unwanted memories with it. They took me to the non-contact visitation area, a small, grim room bisected by a thick sheet of plexiglass. I sat down on the metal stool and waited, my reflection staring back at me from the barrier. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I was ready for this. A few minutes later, Daniel was escorted in. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He was so much thinner than I remembered, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow and dark. He looked like a ghost. When he saw me sitting there, his jaw went slack, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Leo," he breathed into the handset, his voice a dry rasp. You're out? What are you doing here?" I just looked at him, letting the silence stretch. He sank onto the stool on his side of the glass, his hands gripping the edge of the small counter, his gaze darting around nervously. "I've been out for almost 6 months," I said finally, my voice even and calm. But you wouldn't know that, would you? You never asked, you never cared, just like Mom and Dad. Daniel's head dropped, his mouth a thin, hard line. I pressed on, my voice as steady as stone. I didn't come here for an apology, and I'm not here to forgive you. I came here to tell you the truth. It was me. I was the one who sent the file to the feds. I found everything, Daniel DM Capital, the shell companies, your friend Rico. All of it. I'm the reason you're sitting there. He looked up, his face drained of all color. You... what? He stammered, shaking his head as if he couldn't process the words. But... why, Leo? I'm your brother. A harsh, bitter laugh escaped my lips. The sound was ugly, and it felt like it was being torn from my chest. Brother? I repeated, my voice dripping with contempt. You let me sit in a cage for 18 months for a crime you committed. You never called. You never wrote. You never once asked if I was alive or dead. What did you think? That I'd just be the stupid, loyal big brother forever? His composure finally shattered. He slumped forward, his shoulders shaking as he began to sob. But I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just a vast, cold emptiness. I didn't want to do it, he choked out between sobs, his voice thin and pathetic. They made me, Leo. The people I was working with. They said if I didn't give the cops someone else to chase, they would kill me. They would have killed all of us. Mom and Dad, they said you'd be okay. They said you were the strong one. Stronger? I cut him off, my voice like the edge of a knife. That was always their excuse, and it was your excuse too. But the truth is much simpler than that, Daniel. You chose yourself, and they chose you. I had no one, so I had to choose myself too. I paused, holding his gaze, making sure he saw the absolute finality in my eyes. Now you get to pay your debt, not for what you did to me, but for what you did. Daniel just kept weeping, his head in his hands. I stood up, my part in this conversation finished. Take care of yourself in here, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Then I turned and walked out of the room. I could hear his muffled sobs through the thick glass, but I didn't turn around. I had given him 1,000 chances, and he had thrown every single one of them away. It was time to close that door for good. A few days later, I drove back to the old neighborhood, the one where my parents' house had once been the center of my universe. It looked smaller now and shabbier, the paint peeling in long strips, the iron gate flecked with orange rust. I hadn't called. They didn't know I was out. They didn't know anything about my life. Their complete and total silence for the past 18 months was all the proof I needed of where I stood with them. I walked up the familiar path and knocked on the front door. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with the heavy certainty that this was it. This was the last time I would ever have to face them. My mother answered the door. Her hair seemed to have turned completely gray, and her face was a roadmap of worry. She froze when she saw me, her hand tightening on the doorknob until her knuckles were white. "Leo?" she whispered, her voice thin and reedy as if she were seeing a ghost. What are you doing here? When did you get out?" My father appeared behind her, his shoulders slumped, his hair now almost completely white. "Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at them, these two people who had once been my entire world. Now they felt like strangers I'd passed on the street. "I've been out for almost 6 months, I said, my voice flat and even. "But you wouldn't know that because you never asked. You never cared. It was always just about Daniel, wasn't it?" My mother's face crumpled and she began to cry, but the sight of her tears did nothing to me. "Leo, please, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "But your brother? He's destroyed. They gave him 15 years. You're so smart, you know so much about the law now. Maybe you can help him? Find a way to appeal?" My father nodded eagerly, his eyes pleading. "You're his brother, Leo. That's what family does. We help each other." I just shook my head, and as I did, I felt a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying simply dissolve, vanishing into the air. "I was his brother," I said. "But when you chose him, when you let me take the fall for a crime he committed, you taught me that I had to learn to live for myself." I let that sink in for a moment before I delivered the final blow. "And you should know, it was me. I'm the one who sent the feds after him. I found all of it, the laundered money, the offshore accounts, everything. I built the case against him and I sent it to them. I did it because it was the right thing to do." My mother let out a choked cry and stumbled backward, collapsing into a nearby chair, her face in her hands. My father just stood there, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "How could you?" he whispered. "He's your brother." A final bitter laugh escaped me. "I stopped being his brother and I stopped being your son the day you all decided my life was worth sacrificing for his." I turned and walked away. I heard my mother call my name, her voice thick with desperation. "Leo, please, come back." But I didn't slow down. I didn't even hesitate. I just kept walking until I reached the end of the street. The sun was breaking through the clouds and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the trees overhead. I didn't look back. I didn't think about Daniel or my mother or my father. I just kept walking, my hand in my pocket, my fingers tracing the outline of the old notebook. It was no longer filled with evidence of their crimes. Now it was filled with business plans, supplier lists, and sketches for the layout of my own coffee shop. A small, real smile touched my lips. Justice had been served, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who got to write the ending.